We now move to all things 5G related, and I'd like to welcome our next panel moderator, Adam Krinsky, Wilkinson Barker Nauer, LLP. So over to you, Adam. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn, and hello, and welcome to the IIC's panel on 5G. I'm Adam Krinsky, partner at the law firm Wilkinson Barker Nauer in Washington, D.C., and I'm pleased to serve as your moderator today. 5G offers significant new capabilities. It delivers faster speeds with much lower latency. It supports far more network traffic and handles more devices on the network. And these new capabilities create a host of opportunities for consumers and most definitely for the enterprise space. But if we've learned anything from the rollout of 5G, it's that wireless policy is really important, whether it's transitioning spectrum to 5G or dealing thoughtfully with supply chain issues or much, much more. We're fortunate to have an all-star panel with us to provide insight into these issues today. Allow me to briefly introduce them. Philip Marnick is Group Director Spectrum at Ofcom, the regulator and competition authority for the communications industries in the UK. Chantal Davis is Director of Regulatory Policy at Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada, or ISED. Michael O'Reilly is currently Principal at MP O'Reilly Consulting. Mike served as a commissioner at the Federal Communications Commission from 2013 through 2020. And Jared Carlson is Vice President, Government Affairs and Public Policy, North America at Ericsson. As for run of show, we'll begin with opening remarks from each panelist and then move into questions and discussion. Jared Carlson has volunteered to start us off with a quick primer on what makes 5G different and some key data points on the rollout of 5G. Jared?
All right, thank you, Adam. Appreciate the introduction. So good morning, good afternoon to everybody zooming in from around the world today. My name is Jared Carlson, and I head up all things regulatory with agencies and the administration here in the US. So let's start with what makes 5G different. Now that we're seeing a real uptake in 5G, other than the fact that, as Adam said, it makes your speed test app run a little bit faster and shows much more impressive numbers than it did a few years ago, what's really different? And I'm not going to take this time to talk about larger channel sizes and massive MIMO and lower latency, but I want to talk about 5 areas where you can really touch and see the differences. The first, the type of users that drive broadband. 4G was really consumer-led. And 5G from the get-go has been about consumer and businesses. And it's probably, for a practical matter, the existing consumer-led market is projected to grow about 0.53% per year for this decade, whereas the business-led market is expected to grow about 12% year over year. So the consumer segment will remain the business foundation, and the business segment represents the real growth potential for operators. And what are those business uses? Which brings me to the second area where we see some differences. So 4G started out as a homogeneous business proposition defined around universal internet connectivity service. Simply speaking, everybody got access to the best efforts experience. With 5G, using network slicing, we can deliver real business critical connectivity to support areas where performance, security, availability, reliability are higher and require service level agreements. So mission critical applications that can support users like first responders who have even higher requirements than nationwide coverage, and where nationwide coverage is vital. A third area, moving on to how the service is actually delivered. 4G was a mobile first technology. It was dominated by smartphones, with fixed uses really coming in later. And 5G was designed for fixed wireless access from the beginning. So as US, and looked at the past panel, I think this was an interesting topic to tie into. As the US and nations around the world really get serious now about getting broadband to every single household, 5G allows fixed wireless to become a real alternative to wired broadband, where either fiber doesn't exist or the existing copper lines simply don't give an adequate experience for broadband to a home. 5G can be rolled out faster at lower costs and with a higher synergy between fixed and mobile broadband upgrades. And I said I wouldn't talk about speeds, but that's where it really comes in. 5G can actually deliver those fiber-like speeds that the US government wants to see deployed around the country. And so again, on the network side, fourth area, With 4G, you really had a split. You had public networks, which are provided by familiar operators to us all, Sprint, T-Mobile, Verizon, AT&T. Those were LTE based, and private networks use Wi-Fi. Now, with 4G, but primarily with 5G, we're moving beyond that distinction between public networks and private ones, and we're going into the hybrid network domain, using licensed, shared, or spectrum acquired on commercial terms. And so we're seeing this real convergence with 5G. And finally, last, a word about coverage. The rollout of 4G really started with a focus on urban and suburban areas. But with 5G, at least in the US, operating across lower frequency bands, which is great for coverage, is providing rural consumers with digital access for work and leisure that's really on par with their urban and suburban peers. It gives rural businesses the opportunity to be an equal partner in the digital economy. For example, industries such as agriculture, outdoor recreation, and green energy production will remain in rural areas for the most part, and they'll go through a digital transformation aided by 5G. And so with all that, all those 5 points out of the way, let me talk about how 5G is rolling out in the world and in the US. So first off, we predict, Ericsson has a set of predictions called the Mobility Report, and I urge you to take a look at it. I'll tell you how to get it in a minute. We predict that 5G will become the dominant global mobile access technology for mobile in 2027. And that's the tipping point when the majority of all subscriptions around the world become 5G. And in comparison with 4G, by the end of this, so how do we compare? By the end of this year, we think there'll be 660 million 5G subscriptions globally. And we see 5G hitting 1 billion subscribers 2 years sooner than 4G did. And so, and believe it or not, in the last quarter, 4G subscriptions globally totaled about 48 million new net adds around the world, whereas 5G was 98 million. And in North America, Ericsson predicts that the uptake of 5G will exceed 410 million. 90% of all subscriptions will be 5G by 2027. 5G networks were expected to cover 75% of the world's population by 2027 and carry 62% for all mobile traffic. And so if you look out to 2027, the 5-year period that starts 2022 and goes out 5 years, we see 4.4 billion 5G subscriptions around the world. If you look back to where we are today, 2021, the third quarter has been pretty consistent with the previous two in terms of year-over-year or year-on-year growth of traffic. It's grown about 42%. The quarter-on-quarter growth is about 8%. And so this is where it gets interesting. In absolute numbers, that means an addition of 5.6 exabytes of data per quarter, which is the same as the total in 2016. So that means that each quarter we're adding globally the entire sum of data used 5 years ago. So in other words, mobile traffic in the third quarter alone was more than all mobile traffic ever generated up until the end of 2016. So I think I've gone a little bit over my time, but with all this data that's available, I urge you to take a look. If you just do a search using your favorite search engine for the Ericsson Mobility Report, you'll find it, and all of this data is available.
Thanks, Jared. I think that is really helpful to help set the table for us today. Let's move next to Philip. Philip?
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. It's an interesting challenge, isn't it, in 5G? 5G is something that's for everybody and anybody, a mobile technology that effectively all of us use on our smartphones, and also industrial as opposed to business users. Because I always think in the mobile industry, we talk about consumers and businesses. We talk about people who use SIM cards and people who use mobiles. That's one sector. But in 5G, one of the things that we've been looking at is actually being used by enterprises, being used to facilitate how the enterprise itself delivers services, whether that's on a farm, farming fish, in ports or airports, or in factories. And somehow you've got to try and make sure that you can actually have services for all these people. Now, I'm sure lots of people will tell you a mobile operator will go and build coverage everywhere, and they might well do. But actually, one of the things that we've looked at is how do we enable those enterprises to have the advantage of wireless for the digitization to be able to do things by delivering it. So for me, it's actually making sure that the spectrum assets that we make available are both available to the mobile industry and people who are providing wide-scale national networks, but also to small industries and enterprises wherever they are, to enable them to have the benefit to deploy 5G to deliver those things. As a regulator, we're not really concerned about how people deliver services or who delivers it, but actually encouraging the development of a market. So if the enterprise wants to buy the service itself and build it itself, fine. If they want to build it from a mobile industry, also fine by us. Please go ahead and see how you can get the services to work. So here in the UK, we have 4 mobile operators nationally, and all 4 of them have started rolling out 5G services. So if you have a phone with 5G on it, it'll work in places where they've rolled out. As was just mentioned, in general, the mobile industry has been rolling it out where they need coverage and capacity, and mostly capacity. So enabling you to move from 4G to 5G in areas where you need that extra capacity. And it starts gradually rolling out across the rest of the country. We've always had this challenge where people have said in the rural areas or the agricultural community that they have to wait too long for the networks to turn up for them. So one of the things that people are able to do now by using local spectrum, i.e. getting spectrum of the area they want it, is for them to build in those areas themselves, either with partners or somebody else, and actually build solutions for themselves to deliver. So for us, 5G is really important. It enables not only go faster mobile services for us on the go and all the benefits there, but it enables the industrialization of processes and the use of wireless. The other thing we've noticed, though, when we talk to industry about 5G, is that sometimes they don't actually mean the 3GPP standard 5G. What they actually mean is wireless. So we're seeing people using different wireless technologies, whether they're traditional license exempt like LoRaN and other things, or Wi-Fi, and other types of services, and actually just saying, so why 5G becomes the wireless enabling of things, as opposed to necessarily just the 3GPP standard in a lot of industrial cases. And again, as a regulator, we want to try and facilitate that. We're not saying, actually, you must use real 5G. We're saying, actually, how do we facilitate the use of wireless to enable your business to develop and go forward? So for us, 5G is really important. It's rolling out. It's being delivered in industry. It's being delivered to consumers. And if you want to use it, please come and use it. And people are getting reasonably good experience when they're using it. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. Chantel, we're interested in your comments.
Thank you, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone. So mine follows on very well with Philip's because we are seeing many of the same issues in Canada. So over the past few years, we've really been focused on making spectrum available. As the regulator, that's pretty much our job. So we've had our auctions for 600 in 2019, a recent auction for 3,500 this past summer. But we've also looked at repurposing C-band and for an auction in 2023 and millimeter wave band for an auction in 2024. But as we've gone through those processes, we've seen some of the same trends that have been mentioned so far. And we've been looking at it slightly differently than we have in the past on how we made these spectrum available. So auctions are very much macro. We're looking at big areas for a very long time, and we are seeing quite a few changes on what people want to use 5G for. So in Canada, obviously, and it's a good follow on from the last session, rural is a big issue. We have a lot of areas that are very sparsely populated. So we've been doing a lot more work on making rules that have geographic differences. We do see that there's demand for fixed wireless access in rural areas and more mobile type of applications within the cities for capacity. So we've been working on putting together rules that really do get more surgical on where rural and urban exists and where we see different demands for different use cases and different uses of 5G. We've also been looking at sharing. So, you know, repurposing spectrum, taking away spectrum from somebody is always very difficult. And how do we manage that going forward, making sure that we can continue to operate some of those existing services that we do need and that actually do support 5G. So for example, for C-band, we allowed areas to be considered satellite dependent, and they could continue to operate their C-band operations because they would be serving those areas. But that being said, we did not look that they could continue to grow. On the other hand, for millimeter wave, we've put in place some rules that would allow both the satellite operations and millimeter wave to grow at the same time. So looking for more solutions like that. And then similar to some of the things that have been said before, private networks are become a big thing. We've heard a lot of that in our recent processes. So we do have quite a few industries like mining, utilities, and agriculture who are looking to be able to use solutions and 5G or 4G and any other kinds of solutions to have safety, automation, and monitoring of their systems. And this poses a big problem for us. Well, not a big problem, but it's a new set of challenges because they are looking for more localized services and being able to carve out spectrum for very small areas. So that becomes an issue when it comes to how many of these licenses there are, competition, and how do we manage that as a spectrum regulator from an interference perspective and make sure that people get access to those licenses. So we have a couple bands that we're focusing on. We have 80 megahertz in our C band that we made available for this kind of local licensing, and we just closed a consultation on allowing some unused spectrum to be used by others. But in that consultation, we proposed to use our smallest areas, and we were asked to get even smaller. So right now we're really focused on getting those right tools. Our old tools are very static, so policies and databases and as well as just our spectrum management tools. So that's a big challenge that we see going forward, is how do we make those tools more dynamic. So I look forward to the discussion on all these issues. Thank you.
Thank you. A lot of interesting issues for us to get into there. But before we do, let me turn it over to Michael O'Reilly. Michael, thank you for batting cleanup for us today.
Adam, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure. And also to IIC, I really appreciate the opportunity to be back. In the past, you've heard me give a bunch of speeches. Here, I was always jealous to be able to be part of the panels and actually mix it up. So I get my wish eventually in a different setting. So I appreciate that. When I look at 5G, I think about some of the use cases that Philip mentioned. I think he said it, correctly, whether it's industrialization or enterprise, and the segments that we're seeing, the first being exposed to 5G and wireless opportunities. It is the manufacturing, ag, shipping, some really, deep, industries and high employment, in integrating the technology into every part of their business line. And that's really incredibly exciting. We're also seeing the second part of the private 5G networks are exploding, some in the CBRS bands, but also elsewise, and will continue to explode. So it's really, it's been more on the enterprise side. Certainly the consumer side that Jared mentioned is going to take, hold, and the speeds and latency are going to be incredibly important for consumer uses going forward. But it's, in the early days, it's been those other use cases that have dominated because of some of the standards and some of the verticals that are built into the standard. We really see, all types of different enterprises entering the field. And that's a little, we always talked about 5G in the past, and I may have given an example of, remote surgery. And sure, that may be down the road some point. I saw a video recently of, someone doing remote surgery on a banana, pulling a raisin out of it. That's great. And really exciting stuff. And I look forward to that some point, but I'm not sure I'm ready for someone to do that on my appendix just yet. Keep with the fruit and maybe some pigs or goats or something. But we'll get there eventually. In the meantime, it's really being ingrained in all kinds of GDP important segments of the economy. And that's really beneficial for a nation. I think the speeds that Jared talked about, I've always called it wireless fiber, because we're getting to that point when it's indiscriminate of technology. You can offer anything you want over this, and then that really gets you to the next stage of 6G. What's going to be 6G? Well, now is the important time to be talking about 6G, and regulators across the globe should be talking about 6G and trying to figure out, how do we collaborate? How do we work within academia? How do we work within governments? How do we work collaboratively to have that conversation, both internal and domestic, because there's certainly a competitive balance to that, but also internationally in the standard setting bodies and going forward, because in many instances, we're talking about higher frequencies, terahertz, and we're talking about what does that mean, but it's really now to start that conversation and really move forward in a thoughtful way, collaboratively, is really important. I want to be honest to the title of the panel and talk about the other two pieces. Certainly, Chantel talked about spectrum. We have spectrum fights in the United States. They're well well talked about, well known. We certainly have fights with federal agencies, and I'm sure we'll get into that the questions. We're having a recent one with our federal aviation's issues and our friends in the industry. We're also having to figure out how do we make the pipeline more discriminate, and how do we make it more, what's the timing thing. So when we talk about making spectrum available for exclusive use, licensed, unlicensed, or shared models, what are those new bands that we can, have going forward? I worry that the United States is not well positioned for going forward. We've done a ton of work in the last 5 to 7 years, certainly when I was at the commission, but looking, at my lens in the next 3 to 5 years, I worry that, when people talk about the lower 3 gigahertz, or they talk about 7 or 8 or 12 gigahertz, what is going to be the next band in the United States, and what does that mean internationally and globally? We've had obviously international fights over millimeter wave, and we'll continue to do so, I'm sure, as we get into work 23. So some serious work to be had there, but I really worry that we're not spending enough time on spectrum to have that pipeline going forward, and making sure that we're dealing with it internationally in a manner that opens up opportunity rather than the protectionism that I've seen in the past. The third issue, to be honest, to the panel, I want to talk about is how do we deal with the fact that many manufacturers are global in nature, and how do we treat those in a time when we're trying to be mindful of supply chain and also of national security. In the United States, we worry rightfully, and I've been part of past decisions on how do we make sure that networks that are used and the equipment that is used is mindful of our national security, and how do other nations that we're allied with do the same. Been really working hard to make sure that what's instead of measuring where a company manufactures its equipment, or where it's headquartered, or where the work is done, we should we've been shifting we should be moving instead, in my opinion, moving to trustworthiness. How can we trust those companies? How do we make sure that the work that is entering into any particular nation is valuable, and that it can be used without concern to national security? And that, to me, is the better measurement, rather than where's the headquarters or where was it manufactured. We're in a global equipment manufacturing space and have been there for such a long time, and we can't dispute that or ignore that as we move forward in terms of the next network, 5G, or we even have a conversation about 6G. We should honor that and respect that global manufacturers have an incredible value to supply chain and to the building and deployment of networks, and we should not denigrate them. And we've had those debates in the United States, trying to be protectionism in some regards here for local manufacturers. And when you expose what's local anymore, that conversation shifts, because U.S. manufacturers have some local flavor, but they also have a lot of international components to them, and we have to recognize that. So when we have this debate, so I want to touch about those three things. I'm sure we're going to get into it as we get into the question stage, and thank you so much for listening.
Great, thank you, Mike. And there's a lot to unpack there, and I look forward to that. Why don't we start with 5G spectrum? And Philip, maybe we can start with you. We've heard a lot over time about high band, mid band, and low band. And 5G in the US is being deployed in all of those segments. Tell us a little bit about what's going on in the UK. What bands are gaining significant traction for 5G, and what's attractive about those bands, and what's the status of licensing and deployments in those bands?
No problem at all. So over here, we've cleared the 700 megahertz band, which was used for television, and we made that available, and people are rolling that out now as well. We've also cleared the band between 3.4 and 3.8 gigahertz, which was available and called mid-band now, and that's we've auctioned that in 2 auctions, and that's being rolled out by operators across the UK. People have a variety of channel sizes which they're deploying. That's going out. We've also made the band 3.8 to 4.2 gigahertz available, which is shared for local industries and others. So we're actually making that available, so you can get that on sort of local licenses for either medium power or low power, so either indoor or outdoor usage. And that's available for industrial users, or actually anyone who wants to use it. We haven't made millimetric waves available, to be honest with you. We've made them available for local access for indoor use, the entire band from 24.25 up to 27.5 gigahertz. but actually the demand for it outdoors has been quite quiet. And so people are using it indoors and not doing it. So we've got that available to make available. We're looking at it. We're looking at other uses in the band, and we'll sort of, if people really used it, they'd want it. So for us, actually, most of our usage has now been in the sort of what you call low bands, the medium frequency bands. People have been refarming spectrum and using DSS capability to change current spectrum bands to use for 5G as well. So actually, this is quite an interesting technology. Whilst people are rolling out the mid-band and providing more capacity, the ability of this technology to actually say, I've already got national rollout, and I'm now going to use a technical capability to move it between 4G or 5G, depending what handset turns up, means that some of the challenges you had in the past about getting coverage quickly no longer exist. Because you can actually now more or less move to national coverage by doing that sort of capability. So for us, that's what's rolling out. Like most other people, and like Michael was saying before, yeah, we're looking at what future bands people will need and won't need for this sort of stuff. We haven't really come to any conclusions yet, and we are obviously engaging in the discussions for WRC 23, where again, even if you look at the agenda, the amount of spectrum bands on it for IMT, it's very low. There's some discussions in some parts of the world and some others. And you have to ask yourselves, traditionally, we've been delivering more and more spectrum for mobile. Are we changing now, as the millimetric wave comes on stream, that people can actually have vast quantities of spectrum? And now we're seeing the densification of networks to enable people to get the quality of experience they want. Instead of sustaining the same level of macro cells and deploying more and more spectrum bands on it, actually densifying networks to enable people to have an experience. And the balance of what becomes the network and what becomes the spectrum requirements might be changing. And it's one of the things we need to consider as we move forward.
Great, thank you. Chantel, you touched a little bit on some of the bands that you're working with in Canada. Can you tell us a little bit more about 5G spectrum and licensing and deployments?
Yeah, sure. So to date, most of the operators in Canada have actually deployed on 600 and other bands that they had available. So they've been waiting for the 3500 auction, obviously, to have more of a larger bandwidth in order to deploy 5G. But they started in existing bands that they had. So we had the 600 megahertz auction in 2019, as I mentioned. The 3500 auction just happened. We expect in the next probably 6 months or so for that to come online and to be very well used across Canada. And we, similar to the Ofcom, we were actually planning to auction our millimeter wave bands, similar to what the US did. But we found that people had more demand for the mid-band. So we switched our auction planning. So we're doing the C-band before for millimeter wave. And we haven't seen that much demand yet for millimeter wave. And we do see that our operators are really focused on deploying within the mid-band. And on top of that, we have also released the 6 gigahertz band. I know it's not 5G, but it fits in with all these bands as well. So that's a big chunk of spectrum that will be available for operators as well. Going forward, similar to Ofcom, we're not quite sure what the next set of bands will be. We are looking at maybe releasing more in millimeter wave and some other small pieces that we had in our spectrum outlook, but there's nothing that's really coming in as being the next big band at this point. Thanks.
Thank you. Mike, can you give us your perspective on how we're doing in terms of 5G spectrum and 5G licensing and deployment here in the US?
Yeah, I think it's somewhat similar to what Philip outlined. We obviously spent a great deal of time at the FCC working on millimeter wave frequencies, 24, 26, 28, kind of that portfolio 37, 39, worked hard on making those happen. We had problems globally, we had problems domestically to make that happen, but I think we worked through those. I kind of pivoted about 5 years ago, recognizing, as Chantal talked about, how mid-bands are becoming more important. That doesn't mean the millimeter wave is not going to be important. It's probably just a little bit down the road, and carriers are trying to figure out exactly how to incorporate that into their networks. But I shifted to mid-bands, and then you're starting to see the importance of that. It took 5 years to make C-band available in the United States, and we're just getting close to turning the first phase on for both AT&T and Verizon. Obviously, T-Mobile is working on a 2.5 spectrum that they obtained in the Sprint merger. So we're seeing 5G just right at the pitch for consumer services and exploding really quickly. They're obviously repurposing other bands that carriers already have access to, and doing that on a constant basis, and migrating handsets to 5G and converting certainly away from and turning the 3G networks off. So we're continuing to do that. Where I worry, and I think this gets to your question, how are we, and I alluded to this a little bit in my opening comments, how are we set for the future? And I worry that we're not. We're going to still need more exclusive licensed spectrum in the mid bands. And where's that going to come from? I worry that we don't have a great plan. Obviously, lower 3 has been talked about since we've, set up the stage for C-band and CBRS, and below CBRS, how can we use part of that 3.45 auction? We hope to have data on who won relatively soon. But if they're below that, there's, a good chunk of spectrum that has federal users, DoD, there's a big predominant user in that space. And how can we obtain spectrum for either whether licensed, sharing, or unlicensed purposes within that portion? And we're going to see the U.S. Congress is very, very engaged in that process and push moved it forward. But the deadlines that they've sought are really out 2-3 years out there. So we're talking. I worry that pipeline is much longer than it should be, much emptier than it needs to be, and the timelines are much more expanded than they have to be for competitiveness, not only domestically but internationally.
Thank you. Jared, what's Ericsson's perspective on key 5G bands here in the US and globally? And we've heard a lot from the other panelists focusing on mid-band, quite a bit on 3 gigahertz. I'm wondering if you can also address the import of spectrum harmonization, either globally or regionally, and the impact that can have as well.
Sure. Thanks for that. And I want to build on some of the things that Commissioner O'Reilly talked about. So in terms of priority bands and what we see globally, yes, all the focus is on the mid-band, as it should be. It really does combine the sweet spot, if you will, between coverage and capacity for 5G. And it's kind of funny if you think about what the mid-band is today. When we talk about the mid-band, we're primarily talking about the C-band, which, depending on how you want to define it, stretches somewhere from the lower 3 gigahertz range all the way up to about 4.2 gigahertz. So thought of high band a few years ago is now the mid band, but that really is the spot that Ericsson is focused on, and I think that operators around the world are as a global roaming 5G band, frankly, and so much benefit from having a band that works around the world. For Ericsson, obviously, it means fewer different radios to make. If you have more global harmonization, you get the benefits of being able to make one radio that'll work around the world, and that drives costs down. But it's not just for Ericsson. I mean, it's for consumers as well as the manufacturers that make end user devices, right? So if you make end user devices and you've got to worry about different countries' band plans not aligning, that just makes things more complex for you. So we're always interested in doing whatever we can to make sure that to the extent possible, there is some global harmonization. And it also inures to the benefit of consumers, because it means that roaming becomes less of an issue, right? So if you've got devices that will work around the world, it means that you don't have to think about, oh, well, one more of this will work, or whether this, and with this IoT device will work in one country versus another one. So that's a crucial thing for us, as well as just ensuring that, as people have said, that there's enough spectrum in the pipeline for companies to make their plans. I mean, you talk about other industries looking and look at other telecommunications industries. If you're providing fiber, you have to know where your glass is going to come from. If you're providing satellite communications, you're building your satellites now for launch years from now. So at a fundamental level, if you're planning a business, yes, you've got spectrum now. You've got 3.45. I think the assignment phase begins today. So we've got 100 megahertz of spectrum and 3.45 band coming out soon. But when you look to the future, how do you build a business without knowing exactly where your future needs are going to be met? I'm optimistic about the bands below 3.45. I think that there are some indications that the US government is doing more than it might have done to try to make the process smoother. There's been this recent announcement that the National Spectrum Consortium has stepped up a process called PATHS, PATHSS, 2 S's, I can't remember why, to bring private industry and the DoD together in a way that might have been lacking in the past in terms of being able to get people together in a room and share information, and potentially sensitive information because it involves DoD spectrum, to try to make sure that can be rolled out in, I hope, a near term. I think Commissioner O'Reilly is probably right. We are talking about several years, 3 to 5, but still optimistic that that'll be the next major source for mid-band spectrum. And then beyond that, I think Ericsson, at least in the US, is really looking for the possibility for moving into the 7 and 8 gigahertz range, which is lightly used, or well, it is used right now, and doing some studies as to whether there's some potential uses there as the next frontier for I guess we'll still call it mid-band spectrum, even though it's at 7 and 8 gigahertz.
Thanks, Jared. I'd like to follow up on the spectrum harmonization point, and from the regulator perspective, how much of a priority spectrum harmonization is from the government perspective, and is that something that that you all have focused on as you're looking at identifying new bands for 5G and wireless services, and what the challenges that you face as you look at new bands? Anybody want to take that?
I'm happy to.
Thank you. Yeah.
So I think spectrum harmonization is really key, to be honest with you. At the end of the day, what you need is spectrum that can be used by many devices as possible across the world. And if anyone thought anything before the last cycle, I and my team and others spent an awful lot of effort trying to get global harmonization of the 26 gigahertz band. And we did it for 2 reasons. One is, actually, it's hard doing mobile on these sort of frequencies. And the more effort that goes into the same place, the more likely we are to get solutions that will work and expand. And the more you have dispersed bands, the more difficult it becomes. So therefore, doing stuff in the same place. But I think, as Michael said, we run into challenges. And you run into challenges because actually there's other people already using spectrum, or there's other people quite close to it. And what you need to figure out is mobile is not the only game in town. So, people quote all sorts of bands which are lightly used, but they're lightly used by other critical services. So how do you then get the balance of things that right, and how do you make a decision that actually that band's ideal in a variety of places? But also, how do you make sure that the people you're going to be next to are sensible in how the coexistence studies work? Because all too often the case that people sit there saying, this is mine, keep off the grass, and don't get too close to me, and I need this level of protection. Some of it is extreme. I mean, we're seeing things at the moment where some people are claiming that even though some services have very, very aggressive filtering, that you might get something 200, 300, 400 megahertz away, causing some disruption that will cause something to a very sensitive equipment, of which you think, my goodness me, what are you trying to protect against? And I think for us, you've got to be realistic about it. So do we believe in harmonization? Yes. We need to work with other regulators around the world to try and find out how you can make things work. You've got to be realistic of the answer. I think some of the discussion that's taking place in the next WRC on some of the bands, actually it's policy decisions, not technical decisions. because what you're looking at is people will figure out a technical way of things that will work, which will constrain things. And you have to ask the question, did you want that to happen? What's the answer? So for me, it's really important that we try and work with others, try and find solutions, find things that work, but also recognize that lots and lots of other things that use spectrum, and how do you make things work nicely together?
Yeah, if I could build off that, I'm a former regulator, not a current one, so I apologize, but I think Philip's got it exactly right. And harmonization, incredibly important. When I was at the commission, we worked really hard to make that happen globally. I think I was a little disappointed and depressed in some points regarding WRC 15 and 19, and Philip probably can, I cried on his shoulder a couple of times on where, if you let the technical people work through things, and Jared talked about some of this, really can solve some of these issues. What we saw, though, is some of the geopolitical issues, or that countries were operating in other bands and didn't want, the rest of the world to catch up, or to facilitate, 5G at the time. And you see that in the schedule for IMT for, WRC 23 is, it's fairly, skimpy. And so, I worry that, that harmonization is threatened. I think it's incredibly beneficial for manufacturers and users, and that's something we should strive for. But that's the problem. How do you move to the technical and focus on the technical capabilities and away from some of the other issues that we're having, some of the geopolitical or competitive nation fights that are ongoing and that sometimes removed from the regulators that are in the room, and playing at a higher chess game. And so I think that's the difficulty to make spectrum available globally.
And I can weigh in here. In Canada, very much harmonization is very, very important. As a very small, not very small, but a smaller country, we don't have the same economies of scale as somebody like the US or as Europe. So we do really focus on harmonization, trying to find the best combination. We harmonize both with the US and Europe. We get the best of both worlds, so we're quite lucky in that respect. But also, we only have one border with the US. That's great news for us. However, most of our population lives within 100 kilometers of the border. So we do have to be very much aligned with other countries. And from an ITU and WRC perspective, we've always supported harmonization as much as possible, especially when it comes to mobile, because it is so key to ensure that we do have the economies of scale across the world, as well as having the most opportunities. And we look at ourselves as a technology adopter. So as much as possible, we try and have as many of the opportunities as we can in Canada, and not limit them based on trying to get a Canada-only solution.
Thank you. I think one of the hot button issues today, and I believe it was alluded to earlier, both in the US and elsewhere, involves the aviation industry's concerns that 5G operations about to be deployed in the C-band here in the US will end up disrupting operations of radio altimeters on aircraft. Radio altimeters provide elevation data and are especially important for airport and heliport landings. Mike, maybe we can start with you on this. I know you've been looking at this issue, and it goes to the heart of some of the intergovernmental points that you made earlier. Can you walk us through the status of the debate here in the US and what the US is doing?
Yeah, so we are in a process of we, and I say as a nation, because I'm no longer involved in the day-to-day activities, but listening to the concerns that have been raised by the FAA and the altimeter industry fairly late in the game. From my perspective, they were certainly raised to me during my time. They were very uncooked and very, not prepared at the time when they were raised with the commission. But we are where we are. The current debate is over whether altimeters at 4.2 to 4.4 could face some harmful interference from mobile operators in the lower portion of C-band in the 3.7 or the higher, 3.7 to 3.8 kind of universe. does the guard band, is it not sufficient of 200 megahertz and an extra 20, not sufficient to prevent any interference in a phase 1 offering? And they've you know, the FAA and the industry, the altimeter industry raised these issues just recently, and the industry has been trying to be responsive based on, you know, in fairness, the data is non-existent, and it's based on particularly one study that has some questions and has been critiqued quite extensively. So we're, you know, Philip mentioned this, you know, is how do we deal with this reasonably? And I think the industry in the United States was just about to turn on, certainly two C-band winners were just about to turn on their networks in early December, and have decided to delay that for 30 days to early January, and have since made another offering that they would be able to, you know, come January, they'll turn on their networks, but protect the power levels at certain airports and heliopads, as you mentioned, to make sure that there would be no possibility of concerns or problems with altimeters, which, to be fair, altimeters play an important role, but they're really a third or tertiary protection for aircraft if other technologies fail. So we're trying to figure out, how do you balance that reasonably? What are the actual potential harms from this? What would be the impact on altimeters, and do so in a thoughtful way? I think we're having also a fight over just spectrum policy and a global universal fight in the United States over spectrum rights in terms of those that already have it versus those that would like to use it. And those that already have it tend to be, as Philip alluded to, unwilling to change or unwilling to release an opportunity that might be next to them. And what are their expectations of protection? Certainly they didn't, the altimeter industry didn't have any concerns when the satellite industry, the global satellite industry was offering services in the C-band, and now they have new concerns. And I think they can be worked through. I think the concerns, in my opinion, are fairly, flimsy, based on very questionable data, but we'll actually play that out. Industry is going to fund some studies with government to try and work through those issues as best as possible. But we have had an uncooperative federal agency, and we have no process in the United States right now to try and how do you curtail an independent agency that has a fiefdom in spectrum and doesn't want to play nice or reasonable. And so that's a big challenge from my viewpoint at the current time.
Thank you, Mike. Chantel, maybe we can shift to you and explore how Canada is dealing with this issue.
Yeah, so this also came up to us sort of at the last minute when we started doing repurposing for our 3,800 megahertz band at the C-band. It started to become a bigger issue, and we realized that we weren't sure what the impact would be given our 3,500 auction. So in Canada, we did put in place some interim rules in order to protect airports and heliports for 3,500, and we will consider it when we're doing our 3,800 process. Basically, we're studying it. It's I recognize that some of those studies we do have some questions about, but at the end of the day, we're looking at safety of Canadians and safety of areas in Canada where we do have quite a lot of inclement weather, and people are depending on these services. That being said, we're spending a lot of effort to try and get to the bottom of where the issues are, and similar to what's going on in the West, there's very little data, so we're trying to find out exactly what's going on with these radio altimeters and what has been deployed in Canada, and that's very difficult because traditionally we don't track those kinds of things, and this is coming up more and more with all these types of services. Is we haven't tracked these in the past, so how do we manage them when these kinds of issues come up? And that's something that we're working on quite significantly in Canada, to try and get better data.
Thank you. Philip, how about Ofcom and the UK? Are you addressing this issue?
I mean, people have seen the report that's come out of the United States, which I think came out in response to an FCC consultation from a university, which is totally interesting. And, people have looked at it and critiqued it in great detail. there was a cross-European group set up. We've got a group called PT1, which looks at mobile in CPT. And in that group, people asked for people to bring along evidence and so information, and nobody's provided any. And we've had no report of any interference or any issues. And these bands have been used both below the altimeter band and above the altimeter band by quite high power services which have been near airports for quite a long time. So it's not, so whilst it's moving to mobile, the bit that's been quite close to the airports has been used for a long time, and both above and below it. So no, people haven't seen reports, but like anything else, if something comes up, then obviously if we need to do something, we need to do something about it. But I think to the earlier point, one of the challenges of all of this is that you do need to understand what you're trying to protect and what its capabilities are. I've run a program for a long time called Loud Voices and Big Ears. Loud Voices is I can control what people transmit, and Big Ears is trying to improve the quality of receivers. Because often what the problem of these sort of things is that people are listening to stuff they shouldn't listen to. And there's been some cases around the world of various issues. So how do we encourage people to improve the quality of their receivers to enable them to protect themselves against other things? And I always think that people should realize that whilst they might have a quiet noise neighbor today, in the future, they might get someone really noisy coming next door to them. So what are they doing to themselves to try and help protect themselves? And when we do coexistence studies, making sure actually we're looking at reality as opposed to just people's positioning.
Thank you. Jared, tell us a little bit about Ericsson's perspective on the C-band radio altimeter issue.
I think if there's some way that we can bring Philip in to argue in front of the FCC, our work would be done. So I appreciate your remarks. One of the things we've noticed is that, and you've alluded to this. First of all, there are a lot of countries, not just in Europe, but around the world. There are 40, by our count, 40 countries already using these and similar radio waves. And I think notably, I think it's Japan is the one that we always hold out as an example, that their separation is actually less. Their separation is actually 100 megahertz rather than 200 megahertz between the upper portion of of mobile use and the 4.2 band where altimeters are used. And also, Philip, I think you alluded to this as well, but here, at least in the United States, you'd think that the fact that military systems have been using the same band for years with operations that are literally 10,000 times more powerful than wireless operations, that if there was going to be a problem with altimeters, that we might have seen it from some of these devices, which are 10,000 times more powerful than radio transmitters are. But I think we've touched on a lot of themes here, and one of them is that Philip and Commissioner O'Reilly talked about, is the idea of receiver standards. That within the community of radio devices that are under the traditional purview of the FCC, it's really not too much of an issue. And you've got market forces that work to make sure, in addition to regulatory forces, to make sure that receivers generally receive what they're supposed to, and like Philip said, don't have too big an ear and are listening for things that they really shouldn't be listening for. But then the issue becomes, how do you work with, and I don't have a great answer, how do you ensure that you have sort of harmony, I guess, between the regulatory agencies that all have some role to play in spectrum? I know it's an issue that Commissioner Carr talks a lot about, which is trying to ensure that we're at a place where it's clear that this one agency, the FCC, is that's where the expertise is, and that's where the final decisions ought to be made. So we're hopeful. I mean, as you have said, we've got a letter from AT&T and Verizon jointly outlining some steps that they're going to take in the short term. I hope that will allow people to come together over the next 6 months or so to come up with some real world solutions that'll work. But in the meantime, it does look like things are at least moving in the right direction.
Thanks, Jared.
I was going to play off of Philip's point. What we need are big minds and a lot less loud mouths on this conversation. And and maybe I'm more guilty of some of the latter sometimes, but it's because the engineers aren't given credit for the hard work that's been done by the FCC. Amazing, you can criticize the commissioners or the chairman or anything that's been done. Certainly, and you can criticize any regulator. That's fine. But the engineers at the FCC are world renowned. Work really hard with Philip and his team over the past, and highly regarded. And I hate to see their work denigrated for political spectrum purposes.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on this subject? Okay, why don't we pivot a little bit? We've talked about 5G specific spectrum, but another 5G area of significant attention is supply chain, which raises numerous issues. Vendor diversity and Open RAN have become hot topics as governments and stakeholders alike seek to expand the RAN supplier ecosystem and pursue interoperable RAN. Can folks update us on this issue and new developments from your perspective? Chantel, can we start with you?
Yeah, so in Canada, there's not a whole lot going on, like from a regulatory point of view when it comes to Open RAN, although there is a lot of interest. Definitely our operators, and especially the smaller operators who are looking to get mixtures of equipment and to do these private networks that we were talking about, are looking for more Open RAN. Traditionally, though, we've really not gotten into the business of regulating that kind of stuff when it comes to like what kind of interoperability people should have, or what kind of equipment should be available. And we've really relied on it being an industry led way of doing things. So definitely lots of interest, but not a significant amount going on when it comes to regulating it in Canada.
Philip, how about Ofcom? Has Ofcom been involved in the Open RAN discussion?
Yes, we are, and there's a reasonable amount of activity taking place here in the UK. So like other people, the sort of supply chain for radio base stations, the number of suppliers has declined over the years. And there's then other issues about security and a variety of other things of which people are upgrading the network. So one of the things for us and entire UK ecosystem is, how do you make sure that you've got sufficient suppliers in here and you've got the cost base, and actually you've got the ability to deploy equipment that's reasonable and sensible. So we, together with some other agencies, in fact the digital cash pools, have set up a Sonic Lab where we've been engaged in helping testing and looking at different Open RANs and providing a platform for different suppliers to come together to use it. Some of the UK operators are already looking at deploying them and how they can use them and what goes on. And again, you're getting the feedback through. And our government has been quite active in encouraging the deployment of Open RAN and the encouragement of people entering the system to try and get things which have a standard way of doing it. The other thing for us, as well as in standards, is that most of the standards for mobile have been set by 3GPP over the years. And to a certain degree, it's vast quantities of people turning up, but actually it's influenced by a number of different people. And one of the things for us is trying to see how you get more people influencing it, how many you get the user requirements in there, how you get the system that becomes standards are actually more global in their approach, and you get the global economies of scale and scope and actually more openness. So for us, there's been quite a lot of activity in trying to encourage Open RAN, trying to develop it. But again, the operators will go and buy their equipment and everything else as they go forward.
Thank you. Mike, can you give us a perspective from the US on what's happening with respect to Open RAN?
Yeah, so I believe that Open RAN has been, embraced in the United States both by regulators and policymakers, and hold out hope for providing a number of benefits, including cost efficiencies as well as diversity for national security concerns. I think that's something that the regulators and industry are working hard on to make happen and make sure, but when I look at, technology and I look at what can be done today, we certainly have national security concerns from some of the providers. I mentioned this in my opening comments. We want to make sure that we're talking about trustworthiness and not just about specific providers that are from certain places. So you want to make sure that how you're going about it is thoughtfully done. And I think Open RAN, has its pluses, and I think that's been talked about and being explored, whether legislatively or regulatory wise, and that's smart to do. But I think at the same time, we have to be mindful that when you're introducing new providers into this space, it may be increasing concerns about network security and efficiency going forward. Is it going to save, is there savings to be had here? That's to be determined. Is there network security concerns to be raised when you plug in a bunch of different network components? Yeah, there's absolutely, and it has to be worked through. And that's, I think, where the United States is trying to, be mindful of, and where policymakers need to be, very cognizant of all the good work that is being done by manufacturers to diversify. I think they've embraced, the global manufacturing world has embraced Open RAN and working hard to make it happen. They want to do so thoughtfully so we don't lose and create more problems going forward. And that's the key in my mind. I did want to touch on the point that Philip raised, which is really key. How do you, 3GPP, how do we make sure that it's been so vital for so long? I was part of the process and want to make sure, as much as we want to have more people involved in the standard setting process and in terms of the submissions, I want to make sure going, in the past and certainly going forward, that the process not be influenced by political concerns. There's been, huge problems with the election process and who's going to actually oversee some of the different subcommittees over the years. And we've wanted to make sure that 3GPP stays centric on the engineering and the standard setting and the submissions rather than geopolitical concerns going forward. So to back to the original, I think Open RAN holds out a lot of promise. I want to do so thoughtfully, and I think that's where U.S. policymakers are working hard with manufacturers to see if that can happen.
Thank you. Jared, maybe we can turn to you for Ericsson's perspective on Open RAN.
Yeah, thanks, Adam, and appreciate the remarks from everyone up till now. It's frankly rather encouraging. Ericsson is certainly recognizing, that more open architectures are the way to go, and we're embracing them. And we actually have, I don't know if people realize this, but in 2020 we actually delivered more potential standards to the Open RAN Alliance than any other company. And while 2021 is still ongoing, we expect to be in a similar position this year too. We want to see that it works and it's done right. Security is something that Commissioner O'Reilly raised, and that's one of the things that we've been particularly active on within the group that will probably be the one to define most of the standards. That's the Open RAN the ORAN Alliance. And I do want to note that, and again, something that Commissioner O'Reilly touched on, which is, the important thing when we're talking about security. Yes, diversity plays a role. If you have more potential players out there, then you've got more good minds tackling the problem. But I think that there are more dimensions to it, and I think that a lot of it gets mixed up in, frankly, a push to have domestic base of manufacturing, when really the main question is about how do you secure these networks. And Ericsson's been doing business in the US for more than 100 years. We manufacture base stations here in the US, and we're a trusted partner not only to our customers, but in a lot of instances to the US government. So and I think that some of the things that, especially that Philip identified, are areas that I think make sense for promotion of Open RAN and show where regulators can play a role. And that is, I think that he mentioned providing a platform for testing and just general encouragement of it. I think that I get nervous when I hear calls from some of the more rabid proponents that there should be, frankly, mandates or set-asides. That we have a proud history in all of the not only the U.S. but also Canada and the U.K. of treating these kinds of issues with a technology-neutral approach. the US never did mandate that there be, that 3GPP define what was going to be the next generation of wireless deployed in the US. It was a little bit chaotic when you looked at 3G, but I think it really pushed the entire industry in the right direction. And that wasn't due to the FCC saying thou shalt do WiMAX or thou shalt do Edge or even CDMA. That was the result of the market deciding what technologies made the most sense. And obviously things are moving in that direction. I mean, we are pressured by our customers to try to be more open. You see it around the world too. You see all sorts of stories about more and more operators trying to push development along, and we think that's great. And we are a major player today. We have a product called Ericsson Cloud RAN already is a virtualized software solution. It can run on different companies' hardware. But I do think that like I said, my fear is that there'll be some push for earmarks, set asides, what have you, for a particular technology, and I really don't think that that's wise public policy.
Thanks, Jared. A couple of the responses to that Open RAN question raised security issues, and I want to ask a question on supply chain and security. So in recent years, governments have determined that some telecommunications equipment from some providers do pose a national security risk. I'm interested in what nations are doing to address those risks. Mike, maybe we can start with you to talk a little bit about what the US, and it's really both Congress and the FCC have been doing on that front to address national security issues with the supply chain.
Absolutely. And I wanted to wholeheartedly agree with Jared's point on ORAN and earmarks and set-asides or some kind of preferential treatment there. I couldn't agree more and fought those when I was at the commission and will continue to do so in this setting. It's just absolutely the wrong process and absolutely the wrong direction for policymakers to consider on the ORAN side. But to your question and on security, I think that you mentioned the Congress and the FCC. I think the entity that I look to and did at the commission, and now it's a more formal one because of the work I did, but it's Team Telecom. How are those agencies that are dedicated to this process, DOD, DHS, DOJ, how are they and three others that are engaged in, whether it's state, commerce, and trade, how are they viewing issues and what are the information from them? I no longer have access, and I'm not speaking of anything of classified in any such imagination, but there's knowledge base there that is shared with the commission so they can make thoughtful decisions on what are security vulnerabilities in terms of whether intentional or unintentional from equipment, and what does that mean for policymakers. In the past, we've done and have worked with the Congress to deal with what's informally called rip and replace for some particular equipment that is deemed troubling to national security concerns of the United States, and are going through that process of funding the replacement of that equipment in a thoughtful way and through a methodical way over a number of years so those providers who were particular, and we know why they are and what the concerns are, that those are addressed going forward. And it gets to the second part is how do you make sure that the global manufacturers that are from our allied nations are not swept into that process, and it's not just about foreign versus domestic manufacturers. It's a much more thoughtful debate, and that's why I've viewed, and I think that Jared has mentioned this, and it's part of the U.S. statute in a number of instances is trusted. How are whether manufacturers are serving the U.S. government, for instance, the most sensitive components are being provided, the sensitive parts of the U.S. Apparatus. How are those companies being treated in other policy debates is really critical. So security, incredibly important. That process, at the commission is relied on and relies on Team Telecom through the executive branch. And I think the same issues flow to the U.S. Congress. If I put on my old hat from my 20 years on Capitol Hill, the executive branch has a really heavy influence on what the concerns are and how statutes are drafted for those purposes, and really work through those things collaboratively.
Thank you. Philip, maybe you can address it from the UK and Ofcom perspective.
So from us, obviously, national security is a matter for the government, not the regulator. And they're the ones who take the sort of lead on this. And like others, there has been concerns expressed about certain suppliers in certain situations, and they've taken action from it. We've got some responsibilities regarding to make sure networks are safe and secure, and obviously we're giving effect to those. But I think it's really, it matters for, as Mike was saying, matters for governments to decide what you should do and how you capture what you want to capture in these sort of things.
Thank you. Jared, Ericsson deals with security risks and threats from bad actors every day. Can you provide some insight into what Ericsson does from a security or cyber hygiene perspective?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Adam. And speaking on behalf of Ericsson, but I think that some of the things that I'm going to talk about aren't peculiar just to us. I think these are examples of steps that other, and proudly so, other trusted vendors also take on when it comes to ensuring that the equipment and the networks that they roll out are secure. So in all of our manufacturing and our software development globally, we secure our own supply chain with tight quality controls, traceability, integrity checks, site audits, and verifications. And so it's not front and center as it was, but I think we're not too far away from this event to remember the SolarWinds attack from last year. So even before that, Ericsson was scanning and verifying and centrally distributing all of its own software. We have version control where you strict methods about how you check in and check out software, and so and logging of every employee that touches a piece of software. And along those lines, the software bill of materials, which is also sort of a hot topic, we do that, and that's something we do our own internal. We have our internal SBOMs, as they're called, for our products, and we make access to those available through a secure portal to our customers, and so that way we protect the confidentiality and authenticity of that kind of information. We also take a holistic approach to security that we build in our systems. We start with layered due diligence, and we align with industry controls. And finally, we look at it from the whole chain, if you will, from right down to the radios that we produce, but going beyond that, starting with the standards. So we particularly take an interest in 3GPP and the ORAN Alliance to make sure that the standards that they're proposing are in line with what the expectations of our customers and governments around the world are. So now, just a brief overview, but I think those are sort of, as you say, probably pretty good examples of security hygiene.
Thanks, Jared. I'd like to pivot now to a few points that were raised in the opening remarks. I'd also like to flag for the audience, if you do have questions, you can use the Q&A function on Zoom to submit those, and we'll try and work those in. But one of the issues that was addressed deals with broader issues of spectrum management, with licensed issues, unlicensed issues, with sharing among different providers in the same spectrum frequencies. Chantel, could we start with you? How does ICED see the balance with regard to making spectrum available on a licensed and an unlicensed basis? And also, what are your views on spectrum sharing versus exclusive use licensing?
So for licensed and unlicensed, we do look at what the demands are, and of course we also, as mentioned earlier, we have to look at what's going on globally. You can't just make an unlicensed band on your own. Oh, you could, but you would probably have a big mess on your hands. So we are trying to find the best mix for Canada, obviously, and we try and pull from different pieces where it matters. So a good example of this is we decided that we would look at the band that's CBRS in the US as an auction band in Canada, seeing that we had bigger demand for 5G in those areas, and not to go the unlicensed route or the mixed route that the US did. That being said, we also then aligned with the US for 6 gigahertz to try and get a license, unlicensed out there. So we do see a lot of demand for both types of services, and we really do try and support the best mix for Canada, obviously. When it comes to shared and not shared, this is a big kind of debate that we keep having in Canada. There is some big desire to have more shared networks. We've had, shared networks, but shared bands. We've had some all-com, all-serve bands in the past. They've been, somewhat successful and somewhat not so successful. So how do you manage that? We don't know that it gets you the best efficiencies. But then we also looked at the models that US did with CBRS, and we're not sure if that's maybe overkill for some of what we're doing. So we're looking at trying to find some sort of hybrid in between. We've been looking at Ofcom's shared band as well as Germany's shared band, and trying to find the best solution between the two. But we do see that we'll have a place to play in there, and there might be some place for third parties, but we're still trying to figure out what that mix is. And I'm not sure it's going to come in a very short order. We're doing our work internally to figure out what that is before we move forward on any new approaches.
Thank you. Mike, maybe we can turn to you next with your views on exclusive use versus unlicensed and the balance there. And then also with respect to sharing, and are there certain models that you see particularly promising on the sharing front?
Sure. I mean, I don't think it's licensed versus unlicensed. It's actually more wireless users going forward in different settings, and you're seeing collaborating efforts going forward from Wi-Fi unlicensed to 5G, and so I think there's going to be more partnerships and building off each other rather than competing against each other. But we are going to need in the United States more exclusive licensed bands. We're going to need more unlicensed bands. The balance you speak of is, in the past, one of my colleagues had mentioned we should have some kind of, anytime you did something for license, you had to do something for unlicensed. And I thought that was the wrong model. It's really, to Chantel's point, is when, what is the demand at the time? And so you wouldn't say, okay, we only want to do 10 megahertz at 6 gigahertz for unlicensed, because that's the portion that would fit with what we did, on somewhere else. Instead, we, opened up all of 6 gigahertz. We opened up 5.9 gigahertz or 40 megahertz there for that purpose. And so you really work hard to make, both universes flush with opportunity to take where the market may go. In terms of sharing, or the shared model, I guess is a better phrase. And I know Philip has his. We looked closely, and I talked to him in the past about this. The CBRS model that the United States landed on, and it is because a number of our bands have federal agencies, certainly in this case DOD, that we can't, we couldn't do certain things with, and it doesn't mean that other countries don't have that, but we have federal agencies that I mentioned earlier that we're fighting, the commercial spectrum with, and so we have. How do you work around those situations? How do you find some kind of middle ground, or a hybrid? To use Chantel's word, and it sounds like you're doing a hybrid of a hybrid, which is really interesting. But to the point, that model, in my opinion, the CBRS model will be duplicated elsewhere. There's a couple places I think it could work. It could certainly work in portion of the lower 3 gigahertz where you absolutely couldn't have DoD move or shrink its footprint. There's still an opportunity to do a shared CBRS model in that universe and in some of the high bands as well. So I think it will be part of the toolbox, but a shared model overall is not something we're going towards. Where I think it becomes really interesting is what happens if we're in the terahertz and we're in 6 gigahertz, if that's where it's going to land eventually. How does that, what does sharing in that universe look like technology-wise and standard-wise? What does it look like, or what are the capabilities going forward? I think it may change the whole conversation. And so I think all of these things are part of the toolbox, and a regulator has to figure out how do we work through these issues. The bigger fight, though, is dealing with the incumbents in a transient, viewpoint in terms of their holding of licenses from the past and decisions that were made, decades ago that need to change as the universe becomes so much more interested and so much more wireless connected.
Thanks, Mike. And I think you raise a really good point that sharing is not limited to licensed and unlicensed or even commercial and commercial, but there's an important element of sharing going forward that is both commercial and government, and some of the inevitable opportunities there. Philip, how about the UK and views on licensed and unlicensed and sharing?
So I agree with Chantal and others. I mean, essentially, there is no right or wrong answer to how much you have. And certainly, like Michael said, you don't say, I've got a bit of this, I need a bit of that. You need the right answer for the right levels of demand to be doing it. I think sharing is sort of one of those terms that's used oddly, because actually, most of the stuff we're doing is exclusive, but it's at a very local level. So our sharing framework, I said we made available a band all the way from 3.8 to 4.2. And I'm giving people licenses in a local area. They're protected in that local area, but they're there. And that therefore enables them to do it. So what part of our strategy was looking at what do we need to do on nationwide licenses, or what do we need to do on local licenses, and trying to get the right, not the right balance between them, but the right solutions for the right problem. I think the Americans on CBRS was a great solution because it's a solution to a problem. It was a solution to a problem of warships going up the coast and therefore having to react to them. But what it gave you is the capability to have devices controlled by databases essentially and authorized that way. And actually that's useful for some things. So one of the things we've been looking at is, do we do that not because of dynamic demand telling people to move, but actually as a way of making it easier for people to get access to bits of spectrum, for the equipment to ask for authorization, for the frequencies to be issued to them to enable them to use it, but they're local at that level. We've also made this part of the 6 gigahertz band available. We actually only made half of it available, up to 6.5, because the other part of it actually is used by other services, which we were looking at and how it coexists. And one of the ways I've said in other speeches we're doing is actually, now there's an ecosystem developed for sort of Wi-Fi type derivatives there. Is there something that I could enable other people to use in that bit of spectrum on a local level by giving them a light license as a localized license to enable people to use that technology, but in the bits of spectrum, so I can fit it in with other things? As I said before, federal, whatever name you use for them, users, and you need to protect them in some places. You need to get the right level of protection. But again, some of the tools to enable to do that is useful. So if they're using it in one bit of the country, actually other bits of the country, you can use the same bit of spectrum for some other service. And actually, again, that's important. And people call it sharing, but actually it's just making local licenses available across geographies whilst protecting incumbents. And I think we need to get all of the sort of balance right doing that to meet the demand, to enable all demand for spectrum users to be met by it, as opposed to having a single solution for one thing. And we can all learn from each other.
Thank you. We have a question from the audience from a former regulator. And the question is really two questions. One, can folks share their views on the use it or lose it concept that could be associated with spectrum rights, spectrum licensing, in terms of ensuring that spectrum is put to use? And then any thoughts on experimental use of bands of spectrum, whether millimeter wave or other bands, frankly, and the ability to introduce disruptive technologies. Any thoughts on those two questions? Philip, I see your hand is up.
I'm happy. I mean, we've made available experimental use in the terahertz bands above 100 gigahertz to enable people to use it on licenses that will give people the ability to go out and play and test and do it, but protections in place for other services. I think it's really important that we give people the ability to do it. We have innovation licenses, other people have similar licenses with different names. And it's really important that you enable people to play with radio, to enable them to see how it works, to enable you to do something in the future. And I think that's really, really big. Use it to lose it's always an interesting conundrum. I know people who have introduced it, and then to get over the use it or lose it rule, they'll put something up that covers something, so they're using it, but they're not really doing what they thought they were going to do with it. So I think you will be quite careful with those sorts of rules in place, that you're not just getting something which is a game playing thing.
Yeah, I guess I'm on the recovering side of this question, the recovering regulator side. Yeah, so I think I'm generally for use it or lose it if done in the right circumstances. I want to be mindful of timeframes. I want to be mindful of how long it may require a provider who obtains a license to build out. But I generally I wouldn't want those things to be extended forever. So I think there's some value to that. So we actually have build out. It can be a mechanism if done right. And thoughtfully, it can work. So I'm mindful. We also have to deal with the issue of use it or lose it or reclaim it. So at some point, and we've, the commission adopted this, is how do you deal with, there may not be right, at the moment, but going forward, someone can use it in CBRS, for instance, for an unlicensed like service, but those who obtain licenses may want to turn on, and therefore they have to revert. And that's what great part of the databases that Philip talked about and what the capabilities are there. So I think there's value to it. It's got to be done very thoughtfully. To the second part of the question, yes, the commission. The commission does do experimental licenses. Works really hard to try and have the test beds and opportunities for companies and providers and individuals to really you look at disruptive and unique opportunities in wireless space. So yeah, absolutely, that needs to go forward. What I'm cautious about is how do we, if people ask for, trying to decide what happens in terahertz and trying to divvy up the land or the spectrum into particular parcels right now, when the market is pretty immature, it's certainly, you want to be mindful of holding back. If we've had to go back and undo, as Jared mentioned, mid-band has expanded, and we've had to go back. The commission has had to go back, and undo past decisions. And you think of what happened at 5.9, we had to undo spectrum that was given for automobile safety and never used. So you want to be mindful of that. And experimental licenses, you want people to try innovative things, but you also want to make sure that you're not deciding for the future and locking yourself into something that may be detrimental, as technology develops. Well said. Chantel, is there something, we have about a minute left. Is there something you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, so for experimental license, we have the same as the other regulators, but for use it or lose it, one of the things that we've recently done is we just closed consultation where we would offer licenses in unused areas, especially in rural and remote areas, for our PCS and cellular bands. So those bands have been in people's hands for 40 years. If they're not going into those areas, we decided that we would consider offering those licenses. Problem comes in when you try and force people to serve areas where there really isn't the same business case for them. And we do have deployment requirements, but you can only do so much unless you do 100%. And then the other thing is making sure that we're not forcing those people who have licenses to get into business arrangements that they're not, that they don't want to be in. And so we've had a call for doing some mandated subordination of licenses, but that's difficult. So we're looking at actually offering those licenses to people.
Thank you all so much. I want to be mindful of our time as well. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to IIC.
Another excellent discussion which taps into several sub-themes which the IIC has been focusing on recently.